Some stories were never meant to be heard. Until now, you're listening to War Tape Files. The radio in the Tactical Operations Center didn't just broadcast sound. It bled. It was a jagged, high-frequency scream of static and desperation that tore through the hum of the cooling fans and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. Broken Eagle to home base. We are black on ammo. I repeat, black on ammo. We have multiple Kias, and the perimeter is collapsing. Where is our QRF? Over. The voice belonged to a kid Vance knew. A RTO named Miller who used to trade cigarettes for protein bars back at the staging area. Now, Miller was screaming into a handset while the world ended around him at grid coordinate 44 Quebec. Staff Sergeant Elias Iron Vance leaned against the plywood map board. His thumbs hooked into the shoulder straps of his plate carrier. He wasn't looking at the digital display. He was looking at the Major, a man whose uniform was too crisp for a place this forgotten. The Major was staring at a blue-lit screen, his face etched with the cold, calculated paralysis of a man who valued his career more than his soul. Negative, Broken Eagle, the Major said into his headset, his voice devoid of the tremors shaking the room. The AO is too hot. We have zero visibility and high-altitude winds are grounding the birds. We cannot risk additional assets in a contested sector. Maintain your position. Out. Maintain? Sir, they're getting slaughtered, Vance said. His voice was low, a tectonic rumble that felt like it came from the soles of his boots. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a battered, unlit cigar, shoving it into the corner of his mouth. The ROE is clear, Staff Sergeant, the Major replied without turning around. We don't commit a quick reaction force into a blind kill zone without CAS. It's an unacceptable risk. Fox Company is a statistical loss. Vance's hands began to vibrate. A subtle, high-frequency tremor he tried to hide by clenching his fists. It wasn't fear. It was the biological rejection of a cowardly order. He looked at the jagged scar on the bridge of his nose, reflected in the dark glass of a dead monitor. He had seen this movie before. The brass counted beans. The grunts counted bodies. Statistical loss, Vance whispered. He didn't salute. He didn't ask for permission. He turned on his heel and walked out of the TOC, the heavy canvas flap slapping shut behind him. Outside, the world was bathed in industrial midnight. A freezing rain turned the dust into a thick, oily sludge that clung to the tires of the MRAPs lined up like sleeping beasts. In the distance, the horizon flickered with warning orange. The dull, rhythmic thump of heavy artillery softening up some other unlucky grid square. Vance headed straight for the motor pool. His boots crunched on the gravel, the sound echoing the grinding of his own teeth. He needed a driver. Most of the veterans were either out on long-range recon or too smart to follow a dead man on a suicide run. He found him near the heavy transport line. Private First Class Leo Rossi was sitting in the cab of an up-armored LMTV, his face illuminated by the sickly orange glow of the dashboard lights. He looked like a child playing soldier. His tactical vest was buckled too high, his helmet looked 2 sizes too large, and he was staring intently at a Garmin GPS unit as if it held the secrets to the universe. Taped to the dash was a photo. A woman and a golden retriever, smiling in a sun-drenched backyard that felt a million light-years away from this mud-choked hellhole. Vance ripped the driver's side door open. The hiss of the air brakes sounded like a dying breath. "Sparrow," Vance barked. Rossi jumped, nearly dropping the GPS. "Sergeant, I was just checking the comms link, sir. I didn't think anyone." "Start the engine," Vance ordered, climbing into the passenger seat. He began checking the action on his M4, the metallic clack-clack of the bolt carrier group sounding lethal in the cramped cabin. "Sir?" The Major said the sector is locked down. No one goes over the wire until 0600. Rossi's eyes were wide, darting between Vance and the dark perimeter fence. "The Major is an accountant, Rossi. I'm a soldier, and right now, Fox Company is being erased because nobody wants to get their boots dirty." Vance leaned over, his shadow looming over the rookie. The smell of cold tobacco and stale sweat filled the cab. You want to spend your deployment checking oil levels? Or do you want to save some lives? Start the damn truck. Rossi hesitated. He looked at the photo on the dashboard, the life he wanted to go back to. Then he looked at Vance, whose eyes were like two pieces of flint. Rossi reached for the ignition. The diesel engine roared to life, a heavy, rhythmic grinding that vibrated through the floorboards and up into their spines. The truck groaned, its metal frame protesting the sudden wake-up. "I don't even have the grid programmed, Sergeant," Rossi stammered, his hands shaking as they gripped the steering wheel. "Don't need it," Vance said, his eyes fixed on the distant orange flashes on the horizon. "Just drive toward the thunder. I'll bird dog the rest." As they rolled toward the gate, the headlights cutting through the sheets of rain, Vance felt the familiar surge of adrenaline masking the exhaustion. They were going rogue. They were crossing the line. Behind them, the base was a fortress of safety and cowardice. Ahead of them, the blackness of no man's land waited to swallow them whole. The LMTV rumbled toward the primary exit point, its heavy tires churning the mud into a viscous soup. Up ahead, the concertina wire glinted under the harsh floodlights of the perimeter gate. Two MPs stood under a corrugated metal lean-to, their ponchos slick with rain, looking bored and miserable. "Sergeant, we don't have a movement track on the board," Rossi whispered, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "They're gonna ask for the dispatch. They're gonna ask for the trip ticket." "Kill the lights," Vance commanded. "What, sir?" "Kill the F******ing lights, Sparrow. Now." Rossi fumbled with the dial, and the world outside the windshield vanished into a wall of ink. Inside the cab, the only light came from the dim, amber glow of the instrument cluster, the warning orange that made the interior feel like a submarine diving into deep water. Vance reached up and flipped down his PVS 14 night vision monocular. The world snapped into a grainy, flickering emerald green. Through the nods, the mud took on a ghostly luminescence, and the rain looked like falling needles of light. "Keep it low, second gear," Vance muttered. "We're going through the gap in the north fence, the one the engineers haven't patched since the last indirect fire attack. If we hit the main gate, we're done before we start." Rossi steered the 10-ton beast away from the lights, the engine's low-frequency thrum vibrating through their seats like a predatory growl. They bypassed the hardened checkpoints, slipping into the dead space between the watchtowers where the shadows were thickest. The truck groaned as Rossi eased it over a berm, the suspension hissing in protest. With a metallic clack, they cleared the perimeter. The safety of the base, the hot coffee, the reinforced bunkers, the chain of command, was now a receding glow in the rearview mirror. They were officially outside the wire. The road, if you could call a track of pulverized rock and craters a road, disappeared into the valley. This was no man's land, a jagged stretch of earth where the ROE was a suggestion and the dark held its breath. "Sergeant," Rossi said, his voice cracking, "we're AWOL. We're literally stealing a multi-million-dollar Vic. If we don't get court-martialed, the major's gonna have our heads on a pike just for the paperwork." "You worried about a JAG officer, Rossi? Focus on the terrain," Vance snapped, his eyes scanning the ridgeline through the green tint of his optics. "We're in a high-threat corridor. This is prime real estate for an IED or a complex ambush. Every shadow is an RPG team until proven otherwise." The silence in the cab became heavy, pressurized. The only sounds were the rhythmic thud-thud of the tires and the hiss of the air brakes. The fog of war wasn't just a metaphor. It was the physical reality of the rain-streaked windshield and the flickering night vision that made depth perception a guessing game. Suddenly, the radio crackled, not the TOC frequency, but the local shortwave. "Any station this net, Broken Eagle. We are taking effective fire from the north and east, base of the hill. We have 3 Priority 1 casualties. Where is the extraction? Please, anyone." The voice was weaker now. There was a wet, gurgling sound behind the words, the sound of a man drowning in his own lungs. Rossi's foot trembled on the accelerator. That's Miller. I went to basic with him. He's got a kid, Sergeant. Vance didn't answer. He was watching a heat signature on a distant rise. A faint, pulsing smudge of white through his thermal clip-on. Steady, Sparrow. We're entering the kill box. They know something's moving out here. They can hear the diesel. We're alone out here, aren't we? Rossi asked, the realization finally sinking in.
No, Verbach. No cas.
No QRF coming for us. We're all they've got, Vance said, his voice hardening like cooling iron. And they're all we've got. Keep your eyes on the road and your foot on the floor. If we stop, we die. The truck hit a deep wash, sending a spray of black mud across the windshield. For a second, they were blind, hurtling through the dark in a 10-ton steel box. In that moment of total occlusion, the distant thump-thump of mortars grew louder, and the warning orange on the horizon flared into a brilliant, terrifying fire. The journey had ended. The hunt had begun. The transition from silence to violence wasn't a crescendo. It was a physical blow. 1 second, the LMTV was a vibrating steel cocoon crawling through a graveyard of shadows. The next, a blinding, white-hot flash erupted from the base of a jagged rock wall to their 11 o'clock. The IED blast didn't just hit the truck. It punched the air out of the cabin. The heavy armored chassis lifted, groaning, before slamming back into the mud with a bone-jarring thud that cracked the dashboard's plastic housing. Contact left. Contact left. Vance roared over the sudden, high-pitched ringing in his ears. Rossi didn't scream. He simply stopped breathing. His hands locked onto the wheel in a rigor mortis grip as the windshield was peppered by the warning orange sparks of 7.62 rounds skipping off the ballistic glass. Through the green haze of his nods, Vance saw the hillside erupt in a rhythmic strobe of muzzle flashes. Rossi, punch it. Get us out of the kill box. The Garmin GPS unit on the dash flickered, hissed, and went black, a victim of the EMP pulse or the sheer kinetic shock of the blast. I can't see the grid. The map is gone. I don't know where the road is. Rossi's voice was a frantic, thin reed. He was staring into a world of grainy emerald shadows and lethal tracers. His depth perception shattered. F*******, the map. Drive the truck. Vance reached over, grabbing the collar of Rossi's vest and shaking him hard enough to rattle his helmet. You're target fixing. Eyes on the horizon. Shift into third and floor it, or we're a stationary target. Rossi slammed the shifter, the gears screaming in protest. The truck lunged forward just as a rocket-propelled grenade streaked across the hood, its back blast illuminating the cabin in a hellish, momentary flare. The RPG impacted the rock wall behind them, showering the bed of the truck with shale and hot shrapnel. Then came the smell. It was sharp, chemical, and terrifyingly familiar raw diesel. We're hit. We're leaking, Rossi yelled, pointing at the fuel gauge needle as it began a slow, steady crawl toward empty. Fuel lines ruptured. Shrapnel must have nicked the secondary tank, Vance muttered, his mind already cycling through the variables. If we stop to patch it here, they'll pin us down and burn us out. We have to clear the valley. The LMTV roared, its engine straining against the incline of the narrow pass. The industrial midnight of the valley was now a kaleidoscope of chaos. Tracers zipped past the windows like angry fireflies, and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of heavy machine gun fire hammered against the door panels. Vance leaned out the passenger window, his M4 spitting controlled bursts of 5.56 into the dark. He wasn't aiming for individuals. He was suppressing the flashes, fighting for a second of fire superiority. Rossi, listen to me, Vance said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register that cut through the noise of the engine and the incoming fire. You are the pilot of this 10-ton hammer. You don't need a GPS to tell you where the road is. You feel it in the seat of your pants. You feel the gravity. Find your iron, Sparrow. Find it now or Miller dies in the mud. Rossi took a shuddering breath. He looked at the photo on the dash, the dog, the wife, the sunlight. He looked at the blood on Vance's knuckles from where the glass had shattered. Something shifted in the kid's eyes. The frantic blinking stopped. He didn't look at the dead GPS. He looked through the windshield, through the rain, and through the fear. "I've got the road," Rossi whispered, his voice steadying. He steered the massive truck with a sudden, violent grace, swerving to avoid a crater and using the LMTV's bulk to shield them from the heaviest concentration of fire. He pushed the diesel engine past its red line, the cabin filling with the scent of scorching metal and blue smoke. They crested the ridge, the ambush falling behind them into the shadows. But the victory was short-lived. The engine began to sputter, the fuel leak finally starving the injectors. "We're losing pressure," Rossi said, his hands finally relaxing their death grip. "Coast it into that draw," Vance ordered, pointing to a natural depression in the earth. "We have 3 minutes to patch that line before the engine seizes or the insurgents catch up. Get the tape and the sealant. I'll provide overwatch." As the truck rolled to a silent, heavy stop in the dark, the fog of war settled over them again. Thick, cold, and smelling of blood and diesel. They had survived the kill zone, but the clock was now their primary enemy. The repair was a jagged patch of high-tensile speed tape and prayer. Vance's hands, normally steady, moved with a frantic precision as he clamped the ruptured line, the freezing rain mixing with the warm, slick diesel. When the engine finally turned over, it didn't roar. It coughed a plume of black smoke and settled into a rhythmic, unhealthy rattle. "We're on a short fuse, SPARROW," Vance said, hauling himself back into the cab. "That patch won't hold under high pressure. We get in, we load, we get out."
No loitering.
They pushed through the final kilometer of the draw. The terrain opened up into a shallow bowl, Grid 44 Quebec. Through the thermal optics, the outpost didn't look like a military position anymore. It looked like a graveyard. The skeletal remains of burnt-out HMMWVs glowed with a dying heat, and the industrial midnight was choked with the heavy, white fog of phosphorus rounds. "Contact! 6 o'clock!" Rossi yelled, but his voice lacked the panic of the ambush. It was the sharp, professional call of a man who had accepted his reality. "Ignore it! We're internal to the perimeter," Vance shouted back. The LMTV smashed through a section of collapsed HESCO barriers and skidded to a halt in the center of the COP. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the gunfire. Then the ghosts appeared. Figures emerged from the mud-choked trenches, haggard, blood-streaked shadows of men. One of them stumbled toward the truck, clutching a radio handset like a crucifix. It was Miller. His face was a mask of soot and dried gore, a field dressing wrapped clumsily around his thigh. "You actually came," Miller whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Tosi said. They said no one was coming." "Tosi was wrong," Vance said, jumping down into the mud. "Load the casualties. Now, we've got 10 minutes before the fuel line gives or the insurgents realize we're the only ones here." The loading sequence was a blur of wet stretchers and the metallic clack of ammo cans being tossed aside to make room. The air was thick with the scent of copper and burnt rubber. Above them, the sky screamed as a salvo of 82mm mortars began to bracket the position. Thump, thump, thump. The warning orange flashes were getting closer, walking their way toward the truck. "We're full," Rossi yelled from the driver's seat, his eyes fixed on the side mirror. "Sergeant, the suspension is bottoming out. If we take any more weight, we'll throw a drive shaft on the climb out." Vance looked at the bed of the truck. 5 liter cases were strapped down, their breath coming in ragged gasps. But standing in the rain were 3 more soldiers, the rear guard. They were the ones who had held the line, their uniforms shredded, their eyes hollowed out by the 1,000-yard stare. And then there were the crates. 4 heavy, reinforced containers marked top secret/crypto. The major's voice echoed in Vance's head. "Protect the assets. The hardware is the priority." "Sergeant, we can't take the gear and the last 3 men," Rossi called out, his voice trembling. "The LMTV is already over max gross. If we hit a crater with that much weight, the axle will snap. Vance looked at the crates, the assets that would save his career from a court-martial. Then he looked at the 3 soldiers. One of them was barely 19, holding a jammed saw as if it could still save him. "Dump the crates," Vance ordered. "Sir," Miller gasped. "That's the encryption hardware. Command will hang you for—" "I said dump the crates," Vance roared, grabbing the first heavy box and heaving it into the mud. It landed with a dull thud, half submerged in the oily slush. "Rossi, get those men in the back. Get them in now." The soldiers scrambled over the tailgate, piling in on top of the equipment racks. The truck groaned, its leaf springs screaming under the impossible load. A mortar round impacted 20 meters away, showering the truck in a rain of dirt and hot metal. The shockwave shattered the side mirror, showering Rossi in glass. "Go! Go! Go!" Vance screamed, swinging into the passenger seat. Rossi slammed it into gear. The LMTV fishtailed, the tires spinning uselessly in the mud for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. Then the treads bit. The truck surged forward, heavy and sluggish, like a wounded whale escaping the harpoon. As they cleared the perimeter, Vance looked back through the shattered window. The warning orange of the mortars was now a continuous fire, consuming the ground where they had stood seconds before. He had the men, he had the survivors, but he had left the assets in the mud. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the cigar, and finally lit it. The flare of the Zippo was the only steady light in a world of chaos. "Step on it, Sparrow," Vance said, exhaling a cloud of gray smoke. "We're going home, one way or another." The sun didn't rise over the base so much as the sky simply bled into a bruised, ash-colored gray. The industrial midnight was over, replaced by a cold, flat morning light that stripped away the mystery of the dark and left only the wreckage. The LMTV limped through the main gate, its engine sounding like a bucket of bolts being kicked down a flight of stairs. The fuel patch was weeping diesel, leaving a dark, iridescent trail in the mud. The truck looked like it had been through a meat grinder, shrapnel-pocked, windowless, and caked in the filth of a country that didn't want them there. As Rossi brought the beast to a shuddering halt in front of the medical station, the base was already awake. Soldiers paused mid-stride, coffee cups frozen in their hands, as they watched the ghost truck arrive. The tailgate dropped with a heavy, metallic clack. Medics swarmed the bed, hauling out the litter cases. Miller was the last one off. He stopped at the edge of the tailgate, leaning heavily on a fellow soldier. He looked at Vance, who was standing in the mud, the unlit cigar still clamped between his teeth, his face a map of exhaustion and soot. Miller didn't say a word. He couldn't. He just touched the brim of his helmet. A slow, shaky salute before the medics whisked him away. "Staff Sergeant Vance." The voice was cold enough to crack bone. Vance turned. Major Harrison was standing 10 feet away, flanked by 2 stone-faced MPs. The major's uniform was still perfect, a sharp contrast to the gore-stained nightmare standing in front of him. "Sir," Vance said, his voice a dry rasp, "I gave a direct order, Sergeant. I denied the movement. I specifically instructed you to remain on grid." The major stepped closer, his eyes dropping to the empty equipment racks in the back of the LMTV. "Where is the crypto hardware? Where are the assets?" Vance took the cigar out of his mouth and spat a glob of dark phlegm into the mud. "At the bottom of a crater in 44 Quebec, sir. We ran out of lift. I had to choose between the boxes and the boys. You chose poorly," the major whispered, his face reddening. "That hardware is sensitive item Blackside tech. You abandoned government property to facilitate an unauthorized rescue. You went rogue, you stole a vehicle, and you violated a direct order during active hostilities." The major turned to the MPs. "Relieve him of his weapon. Escort him to the stockade. I want the Article 15 paperwork on my desk by 0800. We're going to strip those stripes so fast the thread's going to smoke." Rossi stepped out from the driver's side, his hands trembling. "Sir, it wasn't just him. I drove the Vic. Aye. Quiet, private. Vance barked. It was the last command he'd ever give. He looked at Rossi, seeing the boy who had found his iron in the dark. Check your dash, Sparrow. You've got a long day of maintenance ahead. The MPs moved in. They didn't use handcuffs, they knew better, but they took his M4. One of them, a Sergeant Vance had trained 3 years ago, reached out with a pocket knife. With a quick, surgical stroke, he sliced the staff sergeant chevrons from Vance's Velcro sleeve. Vance didn't flinch. He stood there, a man without a rank watching the medics work. As he was led away toward the TOC for processing, a strange thing happened. It started with one soldier near the mess hall, then another by the motor pool. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They just stood at attention. A silent corridor of mud-stained grunts, honoring the man who had traded his career for their brothers. Vance didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the gray horizon. Back in the motor pool, the LMTV sat abandoned, its engine finally giving up the ghost with a final, metallic hiss. Inside the quiet cabin, the morning light hit the dashboard. The photo of the woman and the golden retriever was still there, taped to the cracked plastic. But now, a single drop of thickened, dark blood had dried across the sun-drenched backyard, a permanent stain on a memory of a world that no longer existed. The quiet professional was gone. Only the war tape remained. This concludes today's entry in the War Tape Files. History is written in the records we leave behind. To help us preserve more of these stories, subscribe and join our archive. Thank you for watching.